General Assembly is an annual gathering of Unitarian Universalists to carry out the business of our larger religious organization, the Unitarian Universalist Association. We never talk about it as our denomination. Denominations seem too conventional for us. We call ourselves an association. We gather to vote on matters pertaining to our movement, like an annual budget that funds the association's organizations, like the national and regional offices, statements that affirm our collective identity, as statements of public witness and advocacy. At that time, we also worship together, celebrate newly fellowshipped ministers and those reaching retirement from ministry. One of the statements of advocacy last year, a business resolution, was entitled Embracing Transgender, Non-Binary, Intersex, and Gender Diverse People is a fundamental expression of UU religious values. It was a long statement, and I did not understand some of it, to be honest, but I presumed that it was well researched and represented careful consideration. Acknowledging my ignorance, I defaulted to trusting that the persons who wrote the document were better informed than I was, and that people who were transgender, non-binary, intersex, and gender diverse had been consulted, had the opportunity to make recommendations, and that advocates for transgender rights, like researchers and others, had also framed the statement. I thought to myself, well, this will pass quickly and with little discussion. I was wrong. Some of you who were there or watched it online may recall it, what happened. The transgender business resolution had a few opponents. One of the critics, an older man, cited anti-transgender studies and statements. His arguments against the resolution were based upon one study financed by The Economist magazine, which is more socially conservative now than it used to be. After his critique, the moderator attempted to reassure the transgender people at the General Assembly that our movement cared for their well-being. After that episode, I felt the wish to speak with that older man who had caused such commotion. I wanted to ask him if he had read other studies about gender non-conforming people. I wanted to ask him if he had spoken with transgender persons about the UUA business resolution and about the study that he cited. I wanted to tell him that I agree that transgender issues are new to us as a society and that more research needs to be done. I wanted to tell him that there are always flaws on things that we do, but in the face of actual violence against transgender people and other responses to oppression, we needed to be supportive of their journey, even if new information later arises that points to flaws in our assumptions. We are all still learning. Embedded in that episode, at the Unitarian Universalist Association's General Assembly was a learning. It seemed unlikely that the delegate knew transgender people. Otherwise, he might have known their journey. He might have been aware of their issues and aware that gender non-conforming persons are singled out for violence. The lesson there is that when we read about legislation affecting a group of oppressed people to which we may not belong, we need to talk to someone in that group before we make up our minds about the issue. Sociologists talk about bubbles. A bubble is the phenomenon where individuals primarily interact with people who share similar beliefs and opinions, leading to echo chambers and reinforcing existing viewpoints, maybe even accelerating those viewpoints. Many people in this country are in that situation, and they are swayed by arguments that are repeated within their communities. While it might be inevitable that bubbles exist, it is still our responsibility to gather other points of view, especially when legislation is proposed that affects communities of oppressed people, lest we be ignorant of the reality of their lives. Maybe we also need to be aware of how politicians have encouraged laws that oppress others to manipulate the American people into dividing rather than feeling like one nation, one community. If people are fixated on an oppressed community negatively, it is often true that politicians can pass legislation the public would be opposed to if the public were not emotionally distracted. They hold out something in one hand and do something with the other. They often are very subtle in this kind of thing. In 2015, for example, the Supreme Court's Obergefell versus Hodges case legalized marriage equality, meaning that persons of the same gender, gay men and lesbians, can now marry in every part in the United States. Not that gay men were marrying lesbians, but gay men could marry other gay men, and lesbians could marry other lesbians. At the time, I was very happy for all the gay and lesbian couples I had met as friends and as congregants. Their marriage would be recognized throughout the United States. The long struggle seemed to be over. Viewing national polls at the time reported in news outlets, almost 2/3 of Americans approved of people of the same gender marrying. It was finally real, and most people nationally were fine with gay and lesbian relationships being legally recognized. It took me a couple of days after the news of that decision to muse that marriage equality had been exploited by politicians to turn the public against each other for a long time. From that, another thought occurred. What will they do next? For years, they had counted on homophobia as a wedge issue. As the majority of the American public is accepting of gay and lesbian people, the fear and dislike of them can no longer be used. Who will the politicians now encourage us to hate? It took about 2 weeks for politicians to turn from encouraging homophobia to encouraging transphobia. Fear and dislike of gender non-conforming persons. Now, many politicians are rolling back legislation that protected the civil rights of gender non-conforming people. The governor of Iowa signed legislation that effectively ended the civil rights of gender non-conforming persons this past, I think it was the past week. Previously, the governor of Iowa provided protection from discrimination in housing, education, and employment. The civil rights legislation that she canceled and the State House canceled was preceded by legislation that effectively ended public restroom access for gender non-conforming persons. The legislation stipulates that one use the bathroom of the gender assigned at birth. However, one cannot use even that bathroom if one looks too much like the opposite gender assigned at birth. In other words, if one were born female, then one must use the women's bathroom. However, if one is transitioned and looks convincingly male, then one cannot use the women's bathroom. This effectively means that some people will not have access to public facilities or even workplace facilities. Another bill signed into law will cease gender-affirming care for gender non-conforming kids. It outlaws the use of medical care that would prevent the onset of gender-specific changes related to puberty. Transgender kids will be compelled to use the restroom of their gender assigned at birth. It is only a step away to imagine that other kids will take these changes as signals that the system no longer protects gender non-conforming kids. And they will intensify bullying. I'm just taking that from my own experience about the way kids are at school sometimes. I tell you this morning about what's happening in Iowa. The reason is that what is happening in Iowa is only the beginning. It is likely that prejudice of this sort will come to the Lehigh Valley and other places. As a congregation that is a welcoming congregation that affects us, as a welcoming congregation to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people, this community is committed to welcoming sexual and gender minorities into our community. Implicit in this welcome is that we will also advocate for them, stand with them, and sometimes use our collective power to physically advocate for them, acknowledging that their humanity and our kinship are important. We must not do this because we expect our actions to increase membership or to fill our coffers. Rather, standing up for LGBTQ people is something we implicitly promise to do. One cannot welcome the stranger if one is not willing to stand with the stranger, to carry and lighten some of the burden that person is carrying himself or herself or themselves. These are trying times. Every day, every week. Like many of you, I try to absorb these things that are happening. As your minister, I do not know where to focus my attention. Several times every day, I learn about something that is happening that violates my deepest ethical principles. How can we as a Unitarian Universalist church focus our attention when so many things are going wrong? How can we make a difference? I think that we need to focus on social justice projects that we have committed to in the past and recommit to being a welcoming congregation. This is limiting, I know. We are not, however, able to challenge every wrong that is happening right now. They are too numerous to be spoken of today, and by the end of the day, there will be more of them. We are a small religious community. We have neither the physical space nor the energy to take on a plethora of causes. We need to focus on our commitments, or we may be overwhelmed by current events. Actually, if you're like me, you're already overwhelmed by what is happening. I encourage this congregation to support and advocate for that which it has supported, to stand for its commitments. The reading today from a Jewish source tells us that multiple concepts of gender existed long ago. One of the aspects of biblical research is that it is constantly bringing up something from the past that most of us, even those who have seminary degrees, never learned. Should you account my fascination with the Bible as a form of theological perversion by Unitarian Universalist standards, consider that the sacred scriptures are a form of revelation that constantly opens up new insights into the relationship between God and humankind, an ever opening of a door between that which is infinite and that which is human and finite. Think upon this. Thousands of years ago, the ancient peoples in the Near East settled upon the belief in one infinite God who loved humanity and was present in the lives of everyone. This deity was present in the world in the minds and spirits of all. The people who followed the one God believed that their experience of the divine revealed that human beings could be very different in their gender identity as a reflection of their coexistence with the deity, who also comprised the nature of many entities like we find in our communities. In the passing of time and in conflict with other cultures, the people who followed the one God lost the aspect of human nature that held that there were more than two genders. At some point, we lost the capacity to understand that gender and sexuality are defined in different ways. We in our time can perceive that the ancients knew something that we are only just realizing, that human beings can identify themselves as being outwardly different from our previous assumptions, belonging only to one gender that is marked down at birth. The ancients knew this, though. Many indigenous people have known this. Somewhere along the line, we in the Western religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, lost that knowledge. As Unitarian Universalists, belonging to a congregation that is intentionally welcoming to LGBTQ folks, we are also learning as we stand. Our strength as a religious community is that we can learn and change more readily than other bodies can. In these chaotic times, may we find the courage to keep our covenant and to live our faith that calls us to care for those who face oppression. May the Spirit of life and love guide us to speak for the beauty, the wholeness, and the holiness found in those who experience rejection and disdain. May this faith give us strength to resist. So be it. Blessed be. Amen.